On the 11th of February 1889, a shift boss named Thomas Bracken went down into the blue vein workings above Silver Bow Creek outside Butte, Montana, to inspect a blast that had gone wrong the night before. The powder crew had overcharged a hole in the 800-foot level, and the rock face they exposed did not look the way rock faces in that vein were supposed to look. Bracken had worked copper ground for 11 years. He knew what a fresh blast face looked like: the raw seam of ore, the crumbled matrix, the dust still settling in the lamplight. What he found instead, wedged into solid rock that the blast had only cracked and not broken through, was a length of dark green metal, corroded at the surface, but showing beneath the corrosion a surface too regular to be natural, and too old, by every measure the mine's own geologist could offer, to have been left there by any man working that shaft in Bracken's lifetime or his father's. He did not touch it that night. He sent a boy up to fetch the mine superintendent, a man named Walter Dessau, and the two of them stood in the drift with their lamps raised until nearly 4 in the morning, working the rock loose by hand, rather than risk another charge. What came out, whole, was an object roughly 9 inches long, tapered at one end into something like a wedge or chisel head, and along its flattened body ran a series of parallel grooves, evenly spaced, cut with a regularity that neither man had ever seen in hand tooling. The object was not lying in the tunnel. It was not resting in a pocket of loose fill that could have washed in from above. It was sealed inside unbroken rock, rock that had not been disturbed since it was laid down, long before any recorded mining had touched that slope of the mountain. Dessau did what any careful superintendent would do. He wrapped the object in oilcloth, logged its find in the shift book under Bracken's name and his own, and set it on his office shelf until the company's consulting geologist could examine it. That geologist arrived within the week. His name was Ansel Pruitt, and he had trained back east before coming west to work the Montana copper country, and it is worth being precise here, because precision is the only thing this record has ever asked of anyone who touched it. Pruitt weighed the object, sketched it in his own hand, and noted in his report that the grooves along its body were cut at intervals so consistent that a machinist's caliper, run along the piece years later, would find variance of less than a 1/16 of an inch across the entire length. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Pruitt's report, filed with the company and later copied into the minutes of the Montana School of Mines when the school opened its doors that same year, describes the alloy as copper mixed with a trace of tin and a smaller trace of a third metal his testing could not identify with the reagents he had on hand. He called it, in his own words, a bronze unlike any bronze catalogued in the mining literature available to him. The grooves cut into its surface were not the marks of a hammer or a chisel worked by hand. They ran in a spiral, tightening as they approached the tapered end, at a pitch so uniform that Pruitt compared it, in a private letter to a colleague in Helena, to the thread of a machine screw, a thing that would not exist in any recognizable form for another 6 decades. He measured the pitch at just under 1/10 of an inch per turn, consistent across all 11 turns he could count, before the taper made further measurement impossible. Nothing in the tool inventory of a Montana copper camp in 1889 could produce that spiral. The mine's own blacksmith shop, when Dessau had him examine the object, could not reproduce the groove pattern even with a full day and the best files in his kit. Hand-cut threading of that era left visible chatter, small irregularities where the file skipped or bit unevenly. This object showed none. The surface beneath the corrosion, where Pruitt scraped a small window down to bare metal, was smooth in a way that 1889 tooling did not produce, and the rock that had held it, when the company's own surveyor examined the drift, showed no fracture plane, no seam, no natural cavity through which the object could have entered after the surrounding stone had formed. It had been enclosed whole inside rock that closed around it before recorded history reached that valley. The company's response, once Pruitt's report reached the head office, was not dramatic. It was administrative, and administrative silence is its own kind of evidence. The shift book that recorded Bracken's find, kept without a missed entry for the 4 years preceding that February, shows a gap. The entry for the night of the discovery is there, in Bracken's own hand. The 3 entries following it, covering the days the object sat on Dessau's shelf awaiting Pruitt's arrival, are blank pages, cut cleanly at the binding rather than torn. The next entry, dated 4 days later, is written in a different hand than the rest of the book, a clerk's hand, not Bracken's, and it makes no mention of the object at all. Whatever was said or decided in those 3 days did not survive into the written record, and the company that kept meticulous logs of blasting powder, of wages, of ore tonnage down to the pound, chose not to keep a record of the one object in its history that a professional geologist had called unlike anything catalogued. Pruitt himself is the harder thread to follow. Before the Blue Vein find, he had published 2 papers on Montana copper mineralogy in the Territorial Geological Survey's proceedings, careful technical work with his name attached plainly to both. After 1889, his name appears once more in the survey's index, attached to a short paper on irrigation drainage in the Gallatin Valley, a subject with no connection to anything he had studied before. He never published on Montana copper again. He took a position 2 years later at a survey office in another territory entirely, and the letter in which he mentioned the blue vein object to his colleague in Helena, the one describing the machine screw thread, was never followed by another. Men who make a genuine discovery in their field tend to chase it. Pruitt walked the other direction, and walked quickly. The object itself did not vanish into a company vault, which is, in its way, the strangest turn in the whole account. Dessau, before the item could be crated and shipped east for further study, gave it instead to Bracken, the man who had found it, as what the surviving letter calls a keepsake for a job well done under difficult rock. Company records show no formal transfer, no receipt, nothing beyond that single phrase in a personal letter Dessau wrote to his own brother, a letter that survived in a family collection long after the mine itself closed and the shaft was sealed. Bracken kept the piece. His descendants kept it after him. It passed through at least 3 households in Montana before a museum in Bozeman acquired it in the 1960s, where it remains catalogued today, not as evidence of anything unusual, but simply as an unidentified copper alloy artifact of disputed origin, the kind of object institutions file under a heading that asks no further questions. The blue vein object would be easier to set aside as one strange find in one strange mine if it were alone. It is not. 800 miles to the northeast, in the copper country of Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula, and on Isle Royale in Lake Superior, 19th-century prospectors chasing the same metal kept walking into pits that were not theirs. Thousands of ancient mining pits, some cut through solid rock to a depth of 20 feet or more, filled in over centuries with soil and forest litter, held stone hammers by the thousand, wooden shovels preserved in the cold, waterlogged ground, and copper that had already been worked loose from its matrix, and then abandoned in place, never carried out, never smelted, simply left. Geologists in the 1840s and 50s who examined those pits estimated that whoever worked them had removed enough raw copper to account for hundreds of millions of pounds of metal, extracted over a span the tools themselves suggested was not decades but millennia, and then, at some point no record explains, the work stopped. The pits were not abandoned gradually. They were left with tools still inside them, food stores gone cold, work simply arrested. A second thread runs further afield and carries its own dispute honestly attached, which is worth stating plainly rather than smoothing over. In 1974, workers at a sand quarry near the Mureș River, outside Aiud, Romania, uncovered an aluminum alloy object alongside the bones of a mastodon, buried in sediment layers that geologists on site dated far older than any known aluminum production on the continent. The object has been examined more than once since, and the examinations disagree. Some metallurgists who tested it found a composition and an oxide layer consistent with genuine antiquity. Others argued it was more likely industrial scrap, a discarded aircraft part that settled into older sediment through means nobody fully reconstructed. The dispute has never been closed in either direction, and it is named here as a dispute, not as proof, because the honest position on an unresolved case is to say so rather than to borrow its strangeness without its uncertainty. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What the Blue Vein Tool, the Lake Superior Pits, and the Aiud object share is not a single explanation, and this record will not manufacture one where the physical evidence does not support it. What they share is a pattern in how each was met once it surfaced. A find that does not fit the assumed timeline of its region is examined once, carefully, by a trained observer, and then the paper trail around that observer thins rather than grows. The instrument that recorded the anomaly gets filed, not followed. The professional who studied it moves to safer ground, and the object, if it survives at all, survives not because an institution protected it, but because a private hand held onto it long after the institution stopped asking questions. Return to the spiral cut into the Blue Vein Tool, because it is the detail that resists every explanation offered so far. A hand file, worked by even a skilled 19th century blacksmith, does not produce 11 turns of consistent pitch across a tapering surface. It requires either a lathe, a technology present in 1889 but not in a Montana mining camp, and not applied to copper alloy tool making at that scale, or a method of shaping metal that the historical record of that region and that decade does not otherwise contain. The blacksmith who tried and failed to reproduce the groove pattern in Dessau's shop left his own note in the mine's maintenance ledger, one of the few personal comments in an otherwise dry account book. He wrote that the piece looked machined, and then, in the same entry, that there was no machine in the territory that could have made it. Both statements are in the record. Nobody in 1889 reconciled them, and nobody since has offered a reconciliation that accounts for both the precision and the impossibility in the same breath. What the physical evidence demands, if it is taken on its own terms rather than dismissed for the discomfort it creates, is not a rewriting of the whole record of the American West. It is a narrower and more specific admission. Somewhere in the geological history of that copper vein above Silver Bow Creek, before the rock closed around it, a worked metal object, with a precision no documented technology of the region could produce, came to rest inside stone that had not yet finished forming around it. The timeline that assumes no one capable of that precision ever stood on that slope has one artifact it cannot place, sealed in rock, recovered by a named man on a named date, examined by a trained geologist whose own report used the words "unlike any bronze catalogued," and then set aside without further comment by the same company that logged every pound of ore it ever pulled from that mountain. The Blue Vein Tool did not need a private collector to hide it from scrutiny, and it needed no institution to protect it either. It simply outlasted the attention of the people who first examined it, the same way the Lake Superior pits outlasted the prospectors who first stumbled into them, filled now with soil and second-growth forest, still there for anyone willing to walk the ridgelines above Lake Superior and look for the depressions in the ground that mark where something was worked loose and then left. There is a difference, familiar to anyone who has spent real time underground, between a working that was abandoned and a working that was cleared. Abandonment leaves mess. It leaves broken tools scattered where they fell, half-finished cuts, the signs of people who left in a hurry or simply stopped coming back. Clearance leaves order. The Lake Superior pits, when 19th century surveyors first mapped them in detail, showed pits refilled, tool caches gathered rather than scattered, copper masses too large to carry left staged near the surface rather than abandoned mid-extraction. Someone closed those workings deliberately. The same distinction sits inside the blue vein record. The rock did not crack open around a lost tool by accident of geology alone. It closed around an object that had already been shaped, finished, and set down, in ground that then had time, geological time, to seal over it completely. Thomas Bracken went on working the Montana copper camps for another 19 years after that February night. He never wrote down, so far as any surviving letter shows, what he thought the object was. He kept it on a shelf in his own home, the way a man keeps a thing he cannot explain but does not want to lose, and he told the story, according to his grandchildren's later recollection, the same way every time. Not as a legend, and not as a boast, as a plain account of a night when the rock gave up something it should not have been holding, examined by a professional, who called it unlike anything he had catalogued, and then filed away by everyone whose job it was to explain it. None of this requires believing that a lost civilization of machinists worked the slopes above Silver Bow Creek in some forgotten age, and claiming so would be the kind of overreach that lets the entire find be waved off as fantasy. What the record actually supports is narrower. A documented, dated, named discovery of a precisely worked metal object, recovered from inside undisturbed rock and examined by a credentialed professional who used his own technical vocabulary to say it matched nothing in the catalogued mining literature of his era. An institutional silence that the company's own record-keeping habits make conspicuous rather than ordinary. And a pattern, visible also in the Lake Superior pits and, with appropriate caution, in the disputed Aiud find, of anomalous metalwork surfacing in mining and quarry contexts, drawing brief expert attention before it disappears from the professional conversation, while the physical object itself simply persists. The honest question left standing is not whether the blue vein tool proves an unknown chapter of technological history, it is why, in case after case, the professionals closest to the physical evidence step back from it rather than toward it. Ansel Pruitt had, in his own report, the vocabulary of a man who knew he was looking at something outside his catalogue. He wrote it down once, in a private letter, and then he built the rest of his career somewhere else entirely. The shift book, that recorded everything else about that mine, down to the pound of ore and the cent of wages, went blank for exactly the 3 days the object sat unexamined on a shelf. These are not the marks of a hoax clumsily executed. They are the marks of an ordinary bureaucracy encountering something it had no form to file, and choosing not to build one, and saying nothing further about it. The mountain above Silver Bow Creek is still there, though the blue vein shaft itself was sealed decades ago, when the last of the accessible copper ran out. The tool that came out of it sits today in a drawer in a Bozeman museum, 9 inches of corroded green metal, with 11 turns of a spiral no documented 1889 tool could have cut. The shift book that recorded its discovery, and then fell silent for 3 days, is preserved in the same regional archive, available to anyone who wants to see the blank pages for themselves. The rock closed around that object before any recorded history reached that ground, and it held it, undisturbed, until a blast in 1889 broke it open by accident. What was making tools like that, and precisely enough to leave a spiral, a trained geologist could not match to any process he knew, is a question the record poses and never answers. It only holds the object and the silence, and hands both forward to whoever is willing to look closely enough to notice that the silence itself is a kind of evidence. Bracken is gone now, and so is Dessau, and so is Pruitt, wherever his second career eventually took him. The mine is sealed, the shift book archived, the tool catalogued under a heading that asks no further questions. What remains is the object itself, still holding its spiral, still waiting in a drawer for a metallurgist willing to run the same tests Pruitt attempted with the reagents he had on hand in 1889, this time with instruments he could not have imagined. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.